not used, but that doesn't necessarily dictate whether they should have been or should not have been used. Does that make sense? So they aren't used as often as they should, and they should be. But remember that EKG is, when it comes to EMS, EKG is relatively new. Like 12 lead is relatively new to the EMS field. You look at a lot of the medics that are currently working right now, they were trained at a time where 12 lead in EKG was nothing more than, hey, let's find out what the rate is of their pulse, and that's it. And nothing more was done. So like STEMI programs that are now out, those are relatively new to the scene. So so keep that in mind. A lot of the times we see on scene people that aren't doing it because that's not in their mantra. It's not what they've been trained to do. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be doing it. All right. So. We talked about this.
Are we supposed to be able to like see what's going on?
No.
Okay.
You are now. But you weren't at that time. We talked a little bit about this before, just some general statements, and I had a bunch of people standing up here so that we could see the directional flow of things, but make sure you understand what ECG is actually showing you, right? So from a historic standpoint, Willem Einthoven is the guy that kind of set us on our EKG path. We found out in the 1800s that frogs could do all kinds of stuff. So we found out that if you remove a frog leg and you stimulate it, it'll still kick, which was pretty cool information for us to figure out. And then there's this French scientist by the name of Ringer, who found out that if you remove a frog heart and set it in a sodium-infused fluid, that the frog heart would continue to beat for about 30 minutes outside the frog body.
30 minutes?
That was pretty cool. Then there was a series of, he's a French guy, and there was a contamination that happened with one of his experiments with the Seine River, water that came from the Seine River. And so through a modification of that mistake, there was a mistake that was made that he just decided to allow the experiment to continue. Because, I mean, once a mistake is made, it's either, well, you scrap everything, or you just see what's going to happen, right? He saw what was going to happen, and then through a modification, he found out that if you infuse some other electrolytes within that fluid, add some potassium and some calcium to the sodium, if you find the right proportion, you can actually get that frog heart to continue to beat for 2 days outside the frog body.
Wait, how, can we go over like how that works, like with oxygenation?
You know how that works.
But oxygen?
Yeah, so all we have to do is make sure that the infusion of the stuff that it's in is something that keeps the tissue alive. So as long as he was supplying it with an infusion that allowed of nutrients for the frog heart. This doesn't work for human hearts, by the way. It does, but it doesn't, because the human heart requires more nutrients than the frog heart does. So we can't keep it alive as long, but it's still the same concept, we found out. But as long as you keep the tissue viable, then all you need to do is make sure that the electrolyte exchange can happen. As long as that electrolyte exchange is happening, it continues to beat it. So as long as you continue to make sure that ATP production is valid and okay, and as long as you allow those electrolytes to exchange where they need to exchange, everything else is mechanical. Right? Your body is built on this gradients, these concentration gradients everywhere. So as long as we just continue to make sure that those gradients are in their proper places, things just continue to work, right? Which is why sometimes you'll have somebody who's brain dead, and we call them beating heart cadavers. And we call them that on purpose because their heart is still functioning, their body tissue is still functioning, even though their brain might be dead, which allows them to have tissues that are donated to other individuals, this kind of thing. Okay. So, yes, and by the way, Dr. Ringer, who established all that, is someone that you know, even though you don't know him. That's where lactated ringers come from.
So is it pretty much the same formula that he was using, or?
No, because he was using frog hearts and stuff, but it was from that it came from, and we honor tradition, which is why lactated ringers are named what they are. They're named after him. Okay, so Willem Einthoven, we knew about heart electricity and that there was a rhythm to that heart before Willem Einthoven. But what Einthoven did was he packaged it in a way that we could use it. He was the first one to do that, and he won the Nobel Prize for it because he was able to do it, and he did it like this, which was ridiculous.
That's pretty compact.
Yeah, pretty compact. Yeah, so what he did is he stuffed a bunch of wires on us, and then stuffed those appendages in ionized water, and then watched what happened. And you need three things to be able to see electricity. You have to have a positive and a negative electrodes so that you can see a difference in the electricity, because you have to have two poles to be able to see where it's being attracted to or not. So you have to have two poles, and you have to have something that grounds it out. And he knew that. So we had 3 wires. He stuffed the 3 wires on the right arm, the left arm, and the left leg. He did some calculations as to where the anatomy was, and we've known this for since way back, since, I don't know, artists that have been ripping apart bodies and figuring out where hearts are and all these kinds of things, right? We've known anatomy for a long time. So he did some calculations on where the anatomy was to determine that the right arm, the left arm, and the left leg showed the best picture of what was going on with the heart in an equilateral triangle, which I'll show you in a minute. And then what he did was he just had 3 wires. He had a positive, a negative, and a ground. And unfortunately for him, he didn't have a machine that could change what the wires did. He had to physically change where the wires were. So the wires were hardwired into the machine, and it was easiest for him to change them on the body. So he would take you out of the water, remove the electrodes, put them in a different place, stick you back in the water, and then see what happened. And he just looked at it from a number of different angles. Make sense? And then we know the angles that he looked at because we have what's called Einthoven's triangle that I'll show you in just a minute. So in essence, if you take a voltmeter and you take a printer and you add a whole bunch of money to it, you get our life packs or our results. That's what they do. And all the other bells and whistles that come with it are what piles into the amount of money that you're going to pay for it. But in essence, when you break it down to the EKG, this is what it is. Something that measures electricity and something that can print it, either on a screen or on paper or both. And that's all an EKG is. Minus the other stuff that we want it to do. And the algorithms that we pay for to make it come out cleanly, that kind of thing. Good?
So when you put the little electrodes on them, was it just pinching straight up onto their skin? Or did he use pads?
He didn't have pads. He had to take the wire, and he had to use a ionizing gel of some sort because he had to get the conduction through it. So he had to use a conducting gel, and then he had to tie it onto you. He used a cloth because we didn't have things like tape and stuff when he was messing around. So he had a hard job.
3 was not invented.
Yeah. Yes. Right. This is probably the biggest reason why we do and deal with EKG. And I know the graph is kind of a silly graph, but this is what we're looking at right here, and this box right here is what we're looking at. And what we found out was that if somebody has a myocardial infarction, from the moment they have the myocardial infarction, there's a certain amount of damage that's done to their heart when they just started having the myocardial infarction. Does that make sense? Right when they start having it, there's X amount of damage to the heart. What we discovered is that from that moment on to about 60 to 70 minutes afterwards, the amount of damage that was done at first stays stagnant. That's about all the damage that's done to the heart. So whatever damage happened right at the start of the myocardial infarction is all the damage they have for about the first 60 minutes or so, 60 to 70 minutes. But after 70 minutes of continuation of whatever this myocardial infarction was, the damage to the heart becomes exponential. In other words, a way that you can think of that is there's a certain amount of damage to the heart, and then the body goes through a series of things to try to compensate for that, to make sure that perfusion still happens, to give body cells time. It takes a little bit of time for metabolism to switch in body cells, that kind of stuff. So for about 60 to 70 minutes, the amount of damage that was being done is the amount of damage that is going to be done. But if nothing's done to reperfuse that tissue that's already been damaged, then the damage becomes exponential because the compensating mechanisms no longer are adequate to continue to perfuse that area. So, in essence, what we find out is someone who goes through myocardial infarction, we have a window of about 60 to 70 minutes to get them to some place that we can actually start reperfusing that heart before they start to have irreversible and significant damage to their heart. Good? Which is why pre-hospital 12 leads became a thing. Because we started looking at things like, all right, someone has a myocardial infarction. The timing of when this happens to the heart is not based on extrinsic factors. It's based on what's going on with the heart. So it doesn't take into consideration something like, well, it took the person 30 minutes to call 911 in the first place. Right? That 30 minutes that it took them to call 911 is 30 of those 70 minutes that they have.
Minutes lost.
Right? And then you add on top of that, okay, what's the response time of the units that are going to the house? How much time do they take on scene before they decide that it's time to transport this person? What's the drive time to the hospital that you're going to the facility? When you get to the facility, what are you doing for the transfer at the facility, which is usually in some sort of an emergency room, right? When you transfer to the emergency room, how long is it in the emergency room before they're actually assessed by a physician? Once the physician assesses them in the emergency room, how long is it before they've established that this is indeed a myocardial infarction and they need to be transferred to the cath lab, assuming that hospital had a cath lab? Once that transfer has been decided, we are going to move them to the cath lab. What's going on in the cath lab right now? Are they in the middle of a procedure? Are the doctors there? Is it a hospital that has a cath lab that's open 24 hours? Or do they need to page out for somebody? So how long is it going to take to get the patient transferred to the cath lab? And how long is it going to take for the cath lab to be prepped? And then for that person to actually be under the knife someplace? And we started looking at times that were in some cases 2, and in some cases as many as 5 hours. From the time the patient started having symptoms of an MI to the time that they were able to go through a stent or PCI or a bypass or something that they were needing to reperfuse. Right? But if we can have a pre-hospital 12 lead, have someone arrive on scene, look at the heart, and 12 leads, EKGs, not all myocardial infarctions show up on a 12 lead. Some don't show up on a 12 lead because some don't electrically make a change that the 12 lead takes a picture of. But if you rule out human error, so forget human error for a minute, 12 leads that are showing an MI are right 100% of the time. They've never been wrong. Because all they are is just a straight picture of what's happening. That's it. Okay? So then all the error that comes into that is related to us reading it, so our interpretation of what it is, or where we actually physically set the leads to determine if it's correct or not. So assuming that we're right, assuming we did our job, assuming we interpreted it correctly, and we're just looking at what the machine is spitting out, and I'm not saying that the machine interprets everything correctly, I'm saying the picture that is there is always accurate. The interpretation the machine comes up with is based on an algorithm that the manufacturer put in, and that's not always correct. But the picture is always correct. Does that make sense? Okay, what that did though is if we can get a 12 lead done on scene, and we can transmit that to the hospital, then the entire time that we are transporting the patient, the hospital can have the cath lab ready, anybody paged out, elective surgeries moved aside, everything is prepped, and we can bypass the ER altogether. They don't have that time in the ER. They don't have to take blood, they don't have to get troponin levels, they don't have to do all of that first before we can take them straight to the cath lab. And it changed the definitive care of these patients in a huge way. Because now, patients were able to be, from the time of symptoms to the time they were actually getting some sort of reperfusion to that heart, sometimes that was being done within 60 minutes all of a sudden. And as more education has gone to patients, as more education, organizations like the Heart Association and the National Safety Council and the CDC and the Red Cross, as more layperson education has happened, so that 911 is called earlier, we're able to get those patients a lot of the times before we get to that point where the heart is actually going to have that exponential damage done to it, which is the whole point of pre-hospital developments.
So I just came across this, the Pulsar, that we just got demoed it about a month ago. And, because I guess right now most ambulances can't send the EKG, is they get it printed off, they bring it in with them to the ER, but with the Pulsar, they can now take a picture of it and send it.
Pardon me?
So that it gets there before the paramedics get there.
You can do that on Zoom.
Depends on where you are in the country.
Well, locally.
Yeah, it just completely depends on where you are.
You gonna cry? Oh, wow, you made him cry for that.
Sorry.
What's in that?
Would you like?
Shouldn't that, like, I mean, obviously that's nice, but shouldn't the paramedics just be able to read the 12 lead and be able to tell?
They can.
So trust.
So in a lot of places, so there are some places in the country, unfortunately, there are some places in the country where the hospitals can care less what the paramedics come up with. They don't care. You're gonna show up with your IV and the first thing they're gonna do is take it out and put their IV in. You're gonna show up to the hospital and the first thing they're gonna do is disregard almost everything you say. And you can't, I mean, that's a organizational relationship and industry issue. There are other areas in the country, I can tell you right now, there are some EMS systems in this country that are just phenomenal, where the hospitals will take what is said on the phone from the paramedic and make complete changes in what they're gonna do with the patient off the word of the paramedic. They arrive on scene, they've already made changes. It's not that they don't do their own assessments when they get there. And it's not that they don't confirm what the paramedics did, but there is so much trust from that situation that they've already established entire sets of orders on what that patient's gonna receive in the hospital, just based on what the paramedic said. And I have seen systems where you've got two hospitals in the same system that are starkly different with the same agency. Where one hospital, they'll say, we're gonna take everything you say, we're gonna make changes on what you say, everything you say we're gonna take as if it's gold. We want you to establish the IV for us, we want you to take blood for us, we want everything from you. And you transport that hospital and you have all this stuff and they take it as gold. And you can have that same agency transporting to a different hospital in a different part of that city where they go, we don't care what you're gonna do. Your IVs suck, we're gonna put our own IV in, we don't want your blood, just keep your blood because we're gonna take our own blood and we're gonna reassess everything before we do anything. And that's a problem in the system rather than what you're doing to be educated to get there.
It takes a long time to gain trust in the healthcare community.
Yep.
And like Corey said, 12 leads relatively new, and it's taken the medics a long time to get good at it. We are so good at it now that it's like we've gained the trust of the cath lab docs,
Yeah.
but not the ER staff.
Yeah.
The ER staff is still like, oh, we need to get them in here and do a 12 lead, and I'm usually met at the door by the cardiologist going, okay, let me
Let's
see the
go.
12 lead. Yep, let's go. And also, we are not meeting national minimum false positives. It's like we're too good. We're supposed to be calling 12 our MIs and getting a lot wrong, and we're not.
Yeah.
And so they're like, whoa, you guys are really, really good. So
Yeah.
the trust locally has gone way up with our 12 leads. So anyhow, Pulsar is really cool. I had a STEMI in between here in Florence, and I shot a picture of it. The cardiologist was right there, and and there was a student there too, I think, and I said, hey, can he go up with you? And now obviously, if you get a chance to go to a cath lab, they're awesome. They love having students, they love sharing what they do. And it's like watching the NASCAR teams really like working on a car, you know. I mean, it's so orchestrated and it's pretty awesome, so.
Yeah. That was your question, right? Did it get answered? Who asked that question? Did it get answered? Yes. Good. Good. Okay. So we talked a little bit about this already, so just review, right? When we are looking at the electrical activity of the heart, the EKG is looking at the average electrical activity that's happening, rather than the individual cell-to-cell activity. So it's everything all roped in together. Does that make sense? So I think I asked you this question, but how many of you drove south on I-5 to get here? You came from north to south to get here. How many of you did that? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How many came up over 30th to get here? Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So about the same. A couple more came from other. How many came from the south and came north on I-5 to get here today? Okay, so 3. So if we look at that proportionally, and somebody were to walk in this classroom and say, hey, Corey, where does your class come from to get to your class? I would say they come from the north. They come from the north here. Does that mean that I'm saying these ones that come from the south are not worth anything?
I feel at ease.
Exactly. That's not the case, but the reality is that the majority of you come from the north. Now that's also not true, because some of you come from the north and some of you come from the west or from the northwest. Does that make sense? So if I were being most accurate and I were going to point instead of try to use my descriptions to come up with it, I've got a very small number coming from this way, a large number coming from that way, a large number coming from that way. So I would say the majority of my students come from there. Somewhere in between these two over here. That's the general path that is taken to get here. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be a crash over there that changes things, a crash over there that changes things, or a crash over here that changes things. But it means that normally, students come from somewhere over there to here. And that's what we're seeing here with the heart. You've got cells, some of the cells send their signal this way, some send it that 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 way. But when we rope it all together to see the general path that the electrical current takes, it takes this top right to bottom left path based on where the muscle is actually situated, where it's physically sitting. Does that make sense? Okay, that's what we call a vector. The vector is the electrical activity that's happening, any given vector. So there is a vector of the heart, but there's also a bunch of individual vectors. And all the individual vectors make up what the average heart vector is actually going to be. Good? Okay, and this is coming from our cameras that are able to only take pictures of the electrical activity that's happening. So if I have a signal, two equal-sized signals moving in front of my camera, and one is moving that direction, and one is equally moving that direction, but they're both the same magnitude of signal, then from a camera standpoint that looks at electrical activity, it can't see anything because they cancel themselves out. The net is 0. It's like if you earn exactly $1,000 in a given month, and you have exactly one bill for rent, which is $1,000, then you put $1,000 into your bank account, and $1,000 comes out. Your net is 0. Right? So from all intents and purposes, you don't see that you made anything. But there was activity in your bank account. 1,000 came in and 1,000 went out. Right? But you don't see that happened. We can also have additive stuff. If we have an electrical activity that's traveling one direction, and another set of electrical activity that's traveling in that same direction, then that becomes additive as to how much electrical activity is traveling in that direction. Right? So we see in the form of amplitude, if we have this much electrical activity traveling and the exact same amount traveling the same direction, then the amplitude we look at is twice as large as if we just saw one of them. Because there's twice as much electrical activity, and twice as much electrical activity will show up on our EKG. Does that make sense? Yes? No?
Yes.
Okay. If we have electrical activity that's traveling somehow diagonally from each other, my camera is here looking straight down. And if the electrical activity was traveling straight this direction, it would be some level of magnitude. Okay? But instead, it's traveling this direction, then that magnitude will be less. Does that make sense? Because this camera would actually see a bigger magnitude. This camera sees a little less of that magnitude. Does that make sense for you? If I have two vectors, one going that way and one going this way, and let's say it's both at exactly 45 degrees to my camera, and this was a level of 2 on my amplitude, and this was a level of 2 on my amplitude, right? Meaning if it was going straight at my camera would read a 2. And it's, I don't care what unit of measurement you want to use. But because it's going off, it's reading less of that. Does that make sense? And then I have two of them going in other directions, and let's say this is a magnitude of 2, and this is a magnitude of 2. If they would have been on top of each other, I would have seen a magnitude of 4. But they're not. They're going off in two different directions. And if they're at a 45-degree angle to my camera, then my camera would see a magnitude of 3. It would see a portion of this and a portion of this, but not all of either one of them. Okay? So now we're just getting into math and geometry, which I'm not going to make you do. Exactly. I'll make you do a little bit, but not much. Okay? But we see different magnitudes from our camera angle, and based on the magnitudes that we see from our camera angle, we're going to make determinations on. Yes, ma'am?
When you're talking about these vectors, you're talking about amplitude in terms of millimeters and inflection based on positive or negative.
Correct, I am.
So you could have it be 2 slowing down by 2 leading to a negative inflection of 4.
Correct.
Oh, okay, Chuck.
Yep. It's just,
What?
it's just putting them all together based on the direction of flow that they're going.
Right.
That's
But
right.
you're not talking about your x-axis at all.
I'm not right now.
Okay.
In this moment in time, I am not talking about time.
Okay, cool.
If we're looking at all the vectors together in the heart as a whole, is that what we mean when we're talking about axis?
That's correct. Yep, so the axis of the heart is taking all of those vectors up and giving us, this is the direction that it's primarily going.
The general direction, like the students.
That's correct. That's correct.
But each camera got its own vector.
Each camera will have its own, vector. And based on where the camera is located, we can get the overall axis of where that heart is.
Yeah.
So the electrical activity in the heart's not going to change, right? It's going to do its thing. What's changing is where we have our cameras to look at that. And based on all of our cameras and where they're looking, will determine the directional flow of that electricity. We can't see the electrical activity, right? We can't look at Dustin's heart because he's got stuff around it.
Called fat, but
Right? So we can't look at it. But what we can do is we can take these cameras, and with all these different cameras, we can see what they're supposed to look at, what this one looks at, what that one looks at, what this one looks at, and based on whether or not they're positive or negative on all of those different things, tells us if the electrical activity is going towards or away from that camera. We look at them all and be able to say, oh, well, his directional flow of his electricity is going, generally speaking, this direction.
Wait, I think I'm thinking about
So why
axis
is
and then.
ventricle repolarization positive?
Great question.
You didn't
Did you
answer
ask that question last week?
Ooh,
didn't you?
actually, I think I know, right?
I don't know, dude.
So the outside of the heart, so when the depolarization is happening, I believe the inside gets depolarized, the outside gets depolarized, but then the outside repolarizes first, and then the inside repolarizes. So it makes it so the T wave is a upward instead of down.
Anyone understand what he just said?
Nope.
Yeah.
It's not just one layer of cells firing.
Repolarized.
Visual object.
You have the membrane, and you have different voltage on each side of that membrane.
So you're firing not only from SA to AV down, you're also firing from inside to out, and it's repolarizing from outside to in.
That's not what he was saying.
Remember, it wasn't depolarized.
Well, my point is it's a three-dimensional object, not a two-dimensional plane.
Yeah, but your camera angle is.
So we're almost there. Here we go. This is what you're looking at, right? So based on all the independent vectors of the heart, based on all the independent vectors, we get a general idea of where the electricity is traveling. And that's based on, that concept is what we call axis. And we'll break that up. We've got the vector of the P wave, the vector of the T wave, the vector of the QRS. They're all a little bit different, and what's normal about them, what would be normal for them is a little bit different as well. We'll focus in on the QRS axis a little bit later, but there it is. Good? And then you remember, just as a point of remembering, right? If something is a downward inflection, we call it negative. Negative, the connotation of using the word negative is that it's bad. And you gotta get past that. It's not bad. We're just saying negative in relation to, we're making the baseline be 0. And we have to delineate what goes up versus down. And so we say up is positive and down is negative in relation to the numbers. But that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that it's a downward deflection. So a downward deflection, upward deflection. If everything is traveling towards our camera, we get an upward deflection. If our camera is behind the direction of travel of that electrical activity, then we get a downward deflection. And if it's perpendicular to that electrical activity, then we have that biphasic thing. We showed that last time in class. So,
Wait,
yes, yeah.
does that mean that the electrical signal is top?
Say it. I think you're onto something that you need to say
It's
to
just
tie onto what Noah said to answer your question. And
Okay,
I'm
so
gonna answer
under
Just going.
depolarization, the cell membrane becomes more positive,
Yes,
but you're tracking the,
Was that you're tracking the flow of that electrical gradient,
which are what ions?
which are calcium?
Which are what charge?
Positive.
So it's a positive wave, because depolarization is a positive wave.
So when it goes
The repolarization is negative.
deflection, that cell membrane is becoming positive.
No, okay, so,
Say that again, Annalise? Wait, I missed what she said.
I said that when it has
Bye-bye,
negative deflection, the cell membrane becomes positive.
the cell membrane is always becoming more positive during depolarization. Because what ions are always used for depolarization? What are the depolarizing ions?
Sodium, potassium,
calcium.
calcium.
Sodium,
What
calcium.
are the depolarizing ions?
Sodium and calcium.
That's it, sodium and calcium. Potassium is not a
Reset.
polarizing ion, it's a repolarizing ion.
Gotcha.
Right? Make sure you're very specific about this.
Yep.
So we have either sodium or potassium coming into a given cell. If it's the contractile cells, we're talking about sodium and calcium. If it is an algorithmic cell, we're talking about calcium,
Calcium.
primarily, as the polarizing item, right? So this is what the EKG is doing. We have a series of cells. Here are my cells. Right? One of them is going to depolarize with the use of sodium and calcium in some fashion, and it is going to become more positive. Does that make sense? It is positive. What is it compared to this one?
More positive.
More positive, right? But what is between this cell and this cell?
Gap
A
junction.
gap junction, which is gonna allow what?
Passage.
Ion flow.
And diffusion.
So
Calcium
my
chloride
ions,
sodium.
my ions are gonna flow to this cell, which is gonna make this cell what?
Positive.
Positive. What's this cell?
More negative.
More negative. What is this cell beginning to do?
Become more negative.
Because why?
Because it starts
Because
to pump out.
calcium's been.
Yeah, because it's going through repolarization, right? So this was positive, it sent its positive ions there, and it is becoming more negative because of it. This cell is doing what?
Becoming more negative.
Becoming more positive, and it's going to send its signals where? It's gonna send its ions where?
To the next
To the
side.
negative.
Why not back this way?
It does, but it doesn't
It
matter.
does, but what?
It doesn't
The
matter,
refractory.
because it's an absolute refractory.
Because that cell's refractory, so it can't respond to it anyway. So it doesn't matter which way it goes, it's just based on concentration gradients, so it continues to go this one, and that one becomes positive. While that one became positive, this one was becoming what?
Negative.
Becoming back, it was getting more and more negative again. Right? And then this one moves, and this cell becomes what?
More positive.
And what happened to this cell?
More
Became
negative.
more
More
negative.
negative, and what happened to this cell?
Even more negative.
Even more negative, as it was going through its repolarization process.
So is that where, I'm looking at the picture right there when it's talking
That's
about?
what's happening right there.
Yes.
Yes. So what I'm seeing
Oh.
is a wave of positivity traveling this direction. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yes.
All right, if I put my camera right here, and my camera is always looking at a positive kind of view, if I put my camera right here, then all of this positiveness that is going this direction, this wave of positivity that's going that direction, shows up like that on my EKG. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. My camera is calibrated the same. All of my cameras are calibrated the same. They're all calibrated the same. So, if I have this wave, if that's my wave, I'm not changing what's happening to the cells. But if I move my camera, and I put my camera here, it is now looking at a positive wave that is traveling in what direction?
Away.
Away from it. Before, it was a positive wave that was traveling towards the camera. Now it is a positive wave traveling away from the camera. And it shows up like this on my EKG. So all I have to say is that if I see this on my EKG, what I have to say is that based on the placement of that camera, the wave of depolarization is moving away from my camera. So, if my person is normal, and their wave of electricity is like this, and I put my camera here, my QRS complex should be what?
Inverted.
It should be a negative inversion. And that would tell me that in fact, that wave of depolarization is in fact going away from my camera. And if I put my camera here, what should I see?
Positive.
It should see a positive deflection. Now, if my camera is here, and I see a negative deflection, what does that tell me about the person? What does it tell me?
It's going the other way.
It tells me electrical activity is going this way. So something has changed in their body to allow the electrical activity to go in the opposite direction that I typically see it as.
So, for the 12 leads, the normal rhythm strip is usually for lead 2, right?
A lot of people look at lead 2
Is that
because that's
because?
the way it's been looked at.
Oh. I was hoping for like, oh, because of this. Because it's like inferior, right? So it's looking up towards, so it's going, electrical activity is going towards lead 2.
Yes, people look at lead 2 because in most normal people, the electrical activity goes this direction.
Towards lead 2.
Because it's going towards where lead 2 is, it tends to show up amplitude-wise as the best lead to see that amplitude. So if we're just getting a snapshot picture and we don't really care about some of the intricacies, it's a good lead to look at. So that's the lead that we look at.
Okay.
It
That's what I was-
isn't necessarily the lead that tells us the most, but it's the lead that we can look at quickly and usually get a good look of the heart. So that's the one that people
What
go to.
Is that because it's the most like like,
It depends on what we're asking.
like direct
It
view
depends on what we're
of,
asking.
like it's going towards the electrical activity, or
Yeah,
the
because,
electric
because,
activity is going
because the electrical
towards
activity is
two.
going towards the camera,
which is 2?
yes, that camera tends to show us a good view of the QRS complex.
Okay.
So if we're looking at a 6-second strip or however long the strip is, you can almost look at this up here and imagine the camera is just following along, whatever lead it is, it doesn't really matter. The camera's just following along the top, and anything going up is looking at the camera, anything going down is not. Or going, I'm sorry, going away from the camera, in terms of
Yes.
electrical current.
Yeah, in terms of your visualization of it, yeah. Okay. If our camera,
But it is not indicative of the charge that is the cell membrane.
well, that's what this charge is the cell membrane. That's what we're reading. That's that wave of depolarization that we see is what's happening to the cell membrane. Right? This cell membrane is what's turning positive, 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 and back to negative. It is the change in the cell membrane.
If that camera is down low and it's watching everything come positive, where does it get its negative deflection? As it
As in, why does
repolarizes?
the QRS complex sometimes look like this?
Correct.
Isn't that
Because we have two hearts. We have a left and right ventricle that are not completely exactly at the same time. So for example, if in my heart, if in my heart, my camera's here, and the x-axis is what?
Time.
Time. So if I have this as my EKG, let's say that's my QRS complex, right? What this tells me is that from this camera angle, at this moment in time, the electrical activity was traveling away from me. At this moment in time, the electrical activity was traveling towards me. And at that moment in time, the electrical activity was traveling away from me again. How does that happen? Well, for example, we get depolarization here, right here first, and these cells depolarize that direction. Which is
Which
why
direction?
that direction. They go in the septum, they depolarize from the endocardium to the epicardium of the left ventricle. This is the left ventricle. So they go from the endocardium.
That's
to
the left ventricle or
epicardium.
right ventricle?
This is the left ventricle. It's on
Oh,
the left
oh,
side. This is my
Okay.
person.
yeah, okay,
This is all left.
got it. Yeah,
This is right.
I'm following.
So from the endocardium to the epicardium, it's traveling that direction, and the septum typically gets the signal first. And so from my lead 1 camera, I see this directional flow, which is why I have Q waves that sometimes show up in lead 1,
Okay.
right? Not long after that though, this is getting the signal to travel this way. And it's a whole freaking buttload of heart tissue that's going that direction,
Uh-huh.
right? So therefore, I get a whole freaking buttload of heart tissue on that positive. And as that's finishing up, as that's starting to finish up, over here is getting the signal a little bit later. And that's moving away again. But that's more tissue than what was right there, so I see a bigger S wave.
So does the left ventricle depolarize in a normal human being, depolarize milliseconds before the right?
Just a little bit.
Okay, so it's almost doing a 1-2 sort of deal.
Yeah, well, there's crossover, so somewhere in here is the right ventricle also going.
In terms of your overall global electrical activity.
Yeah, I don't want you to think 1,
Boom,
2,
boom,
it's
yeah.
more,
They're happening at the same time, but
right?
you're seeing.
It's like when you snap your fingers, you can't snap at the exact same time. They're just a little off. It's a flam, right? They're just a little off.
Is that also why you're talking when you say a buttload of heart contractile cells? You're talking about there's more electrical activity heading towards.
Yeah, because there's more cells.
Because it's a large, left ventricle is larger than the right ventricle.
That's correct.
Okay,
That's right.
that makes sense.
That's right. Right? So each one of these waves is telling you what's happening to the electrical current at that moment in time. Based on that camera.
Is the electrical current towards the camera solely a positive charge?
Yes. No, doesn't matter if it's towards the camera. The electrical activity in the heart is positive because we're talking about calcium and sodium, which are positive ions.
Is that the electrical activity that we read is
What's that?
positive? The electrical activity that the camera reads is positive.
The electrical activity that the camera reads is whatever the electrical activity is, positive or negative. But depolarization of the heart is
That's
positive.
my question.
Depolarization of the heart is based on calcium and sodium,
Right.
and a change in the membrane of the cells from negative to positive. So therefore, it is a positive wave. Repolarization is what?
A negative wave.
Negative, because it's a positive ion leaving the
No.
cell,
It's-
potassium is leaving the cell, and it is making it negative.
But is it seeing the wave of negativity going in a
Say it,
direction?
Annalise.
Of course, everything is based
And that's why the
on.
T wave is positive. 'cause
So
it's
now we're
going
getting
towards the
to,
camera.
now we're getting to, yeah, we're getting to the question that Annalise asked
Yeah, finally.
last week.
Hooray.
Okay? So you saw on the EKG, I showed you the P wave here, and then I showed you the TP wave, which was negative. And that was confusing, Annalise, and it should have confused all of you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that it did not confuse you all, but it should have. Because what was confusing about it was that this was our QRS complex, which was positive, and our T wave was positive. This makes sense and this makes sense because it was depolarization.
Right.
This makes sense because it's a negative wave
Yeah.
that's happening, so that makes
That's
sense.
consistent with the charge.
This is consistent